Welcome to our second edition of our Faithful Presence, Faith and Work webinar series. We're so glad you joined us today. My name is Steve Lindsay. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Faith and Work Los Angeles, and wanted to quickly thank our sponsors for today. We have a host of organizations that have helped make this possible. We wanted to highlight the generous support of 4 of our sponsors. In particular, we have Thrive It Financial is a Christian member-owned organization that they offer advice on banking, finance, insurance, investment options, and they especially have a unique and creative program for cultivating generosity, which I know as Christians we're concerned about. Marketplace Chaplains is a wonderful organization. They provide really customized, personalized, and proactive care services. It's a great complement to HR teams in multiple size companies, and they do things in cooperation with company operations, and all their work is strictly confidential. We also have Made to Flourish represented. They're a wonderful network of pastors and leaders who seek to encourage resourcing each other in integrating faith, work, and economic wisdom in the life of our church communities. And then we also have Fusion Leaders sponsoring us. They're a wonderful group of business leaders across Los Angeles and Orange County area, encouraging spiritual growth and business success towards the glorification of God in their lives. So we're grateful to have them. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to our Framework Fellows program. We still have open applications for this program. It's really LA's premier faith and work integration and leadership development program. It's a wonderful 9-month journey learning to how to better cultivate daily spiritual formation and really integrate your concept of vocation and calling and how that can be a great impact for God's kingdom in the world. So I encourage you to check that out at faithandworkla.com. There's a link to the Framework Fellows program. A lot of great information, including testimonies from alumni and how to apply there. So we encourage you to check that out as well. And for today, we are delighted and very excited to have Douglas McKelvey with us. We are all still experiencing all the stresses of what's going on in our national life and cities today, whether it's anxieties, trying to figure out how to respond to all the concerns over race and injustice, or just the disruptions in our workflow from, could be loss of work, could be just a major disruption, or having to adjust the nature of the type of work or switch types of tasks or jobs or working relationships and family environments at home, whatever it is. We are constantly searching for more faithful ways to live through this in hope and live this faithfully as Christians. So we have a great opportunity to reflect more deeply about this today and explore thinking through especially what God's calling on our lives, how it's intimately related to how we think about the new creation, and that we need to have hope in all this and inspiration for our work context, whatever they happen to be in today. There is a Q&A button near the bottom of your screen. Feel free to post your questions as we go. We'll have a nice block out of time at the end for Q&A. So take advantage of that. And we want to highlight our special guest speaker today. We have Douglas McKelvey with us today. He's joining us as a very thoughtful and accomplished creative. He comes all the way from Nashville, Tennessee. Douglas has participated in the early work of the Charlie Peacock's Art House Foundation. He has had a passion for the intersection of faith and the arts since the early 90s. And the decades since, Doug's creative energies have found him working as an author, a song lyricist, script writer, church sexton, and video director. Doug has penned more than 350 lyrics recorded by a variety of artists, including Switchfoot, Kenny Rogers, Sanctus Riel, and Jason Gray. His latest book is titled Every Moment Holy, New Liturgies for Daily Life, which has been a huge blessing to myself, my family, and many friends of mine. We refer to it often. He continues to pen new liturgies for future volumes, which we're very excited about, and he has many interests. He's been involved, has ongoing projects, including working on a fantasy novel set in the 19th century America, a young adult sci-fi novel, and a board game. So he's really a true creative, and we are honored to have Doug join us today. So let's go ahead and bring Doug in. Sorry about the delay. There we go. Great.
Hi, everyone.
All right. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Well, thank you, Steve and Melissa, for all your hard work in setting this up. And thank you to all of you who are joining. I'm really sorry and disappointed that it didn't work out this year for us to have the conference in LA, because it's one of my favorite cities to travel to, and I was looking forward to spending time in person with those of you who would have been there. But I'm grateful that we at least have this opportunity. And if I happen to look shocked just momentarily at any point during this, don't be alarmed. It's actually just that I went 4 months without a haircut and just got one so that I would look somewhat presentable for this. So when I happen to see my own face on screen, it just looks to me like my head was sort of whittled to a point. So that's the cause of any shock or alarm that I have. So as Steve was saying, the topic of this conversation, of this talk, is rehearsing the new creation. Because I wanted to give you options, an alternate title might be A Coke, a Merlot, and a Guinness Walk into an Existential Crisis. The bartender doesn't say anything because there is no bartender. This is not a bar. It's an existential crisis. But in either case, the subtitle of the talk is How Our Vocations Are Inseparable from Our Hopes. The talk is divided into 3 parts, and part 1 is what the Coke says, or the false hope. So in 1985, Cinema Enterprises and their partners released a film called The Coca-Cola Kid. Now, I never saw that film, but I do remember the movie posters, which showed a shirtless 20-something young man clinging with one hand to a bottle of Coke and with the other to an obviously enthralled young woman. The tagline of the movie was, "A movie never felt so refreshing." It's probably a safe assumption that most of us never saw the movie, or if we did, we quickly forgot it. But the film might have inspired at least one young couple. And a small apology in advance for this story, because you won't be able to unhear it. And if you're a parent, every so often you're going to remember it, as I have for the past 20 some odd years. But that story is this, that several years after the film had its run in the US, a young patient was brought into the offices of a doctor that I know. It was where he had his practice. This was not actually one of his patients, but the kid was a few years old, had been referred to another internist that shared that office space. The child was there because of very serious internal problems. Before his birth, his parents had had what must have seemed like $1 billion idea. Their kid was going to be the Coca-Cola kid, the face of the international brand. How would they accomplish this great hope? Their plan was elegant in its simplicity. Their son would never drink water, juice, or any rival soft drinks. Apart from whatever milk he consumed in his first few months of life, he would always and only drink Coca-Cola, even in his baby bottle. No other fluids would be offered him. And when he was eventually unveiled as the Coca-Cola kid, the soft drink company would, or so the parents must have thought, leap at the opportunity to exploit his story and likeness. Fame and fortune would surely follow. As a disclaimer, let me state the obvious. The Coca-Cola company had no knowledge of this scheme. Even the parents, though they lacked wisdom, weren't intentionally harming their child. They thought they were acting in his interests. They thought they were setting him up for life, and themselves as well. But theirs was a destructive hope, because their vision of human flourishing was an impoverished vision, fueled by a small, skewed hope, so that in the end, the outworking of that hope literally destroyed the most basic physical flourishing of their family. I think this story of impoverished imagination leading to a false hope, leading to tragedy, does stand in sobering parallel to what is often our default relationship to imagination and therefore to hope. Because we will hope most for those things that have most captured our imaginations. In their song Creature Comfort, the band Arcade Fire voiced the pathetic heart cry of a generation weaned on hopes as substantially void as any soft drink. God, make me famous. If you can't, just make it painless. The voices in our consumeristic culture are loud and are not shy about claiming that they have the thing that we never knew we always needed to fill that sucking gulf of the soul. Advertising is full of appeals to transcendence, positing material goods and services as the answer to our existential and spiritual longings. We aren't so much being sold a brand or a product as we're being sold a state of being. Unfortunately, what we end up purchasing is a product, and the state of being remains frustratingly the same, or becomes even worse, for the creeping cynicism and the added debt. And we hardly blink before moving on to the next flashy thing that promises transcendence. But hopes are like the pegs of a coat rack. The question is always whether they can sustain the weight of the soul yearnings that we hang upon them. Most hopes simply cannot. They crack, they shear, they give way. And yet, we keep investing our hopes in what we imagine will somehow complete us. A new car, some pleasure, romance, technology, gadgetry, power, prestige, entertainment, career advancement, to be attractive, popular, cool, famous, strong. Do we really imagine such hopes will sustain us, though? Yet these are the collective dreams that we grow up marinating in. They're the small and insufficient hopes that are held out to us. In 2005, I went through an intensive screenwriting program. And I remember a tragic story related by one of the faculty who had a cousin who early in life had come to associate ownership of a brand new Mercedes convertible with the embodiment of success. And so she had picked a career path that would get her there as quickly as possible and had pursued it with focused determination. As best I recall the story, it was in her late 20s or early 30s that she attained her hope. She finally purchased that brand new Mercedes convertible, the symbol of her ambition and success. And 2 weeks later, she intentionally drove it off a cliff. What do we do when we have achieved a dream and found it meaningless? What do you do when you can't imagine that there's anything more to hope for? Thomas Merton wrote, "We are the ministers of silence that is needed to cure all victims of absurdity who lie dying of a contrived joy." Is that not a good description of what ails a malnourished cultural imagination, suckled by the materialistic and philosophic and ideological werehawks of our day? We are a culture dying of contrived joys, and our hopes are anemic in reflection of that. Our hopes are impoverished because we have not yet imagined a grace wild enough and a love and mercy large enough to satisfy our deepest hungers for meaning, for wonder, for love and forgiveness and belonging, for restoration and wholeness. Our stories are too small. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories we tell one another, the stories we create together as a culture are most often far too small. We see this play out in our vocations when their end goals are some nebulous idea of self-fulfillment or materialism. There is not enough ultimate meaning in either of those narratives to satisfy our deep hunger. And if the stories we imagine and tell are smaller than our hunger, smaller than our wonder, they will not sustain us. No matter how many hundreds of millions of dollars get spent on special effects to distract from the obvious plot holes. We have breathed so long the air of narcissism, nihilism, consumerism, humanism, materialism, that our very imaginations become malformed and bent and inconsistent, divided, no longer primed to conceive of those greater hopes. Like that child whose thirst had been addressed only with an endless supply of sugary soda, our very sense of taste has been hindered and stunted, compromised, along with the entire digestive system by which life-giving nutrients should be flowing. All that we call human history, C.S. Lewis wrote, money, poverty, ambition, war, prostitution, classes, empires, slavery, is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God which will make him happy. This litany Lewis recites are the fruits of imaginations that could not or would not conceive of greater and more glorious hopes. Dreams that shatter were not too big, they were too small. Hopes that fail were not too grand, they were never grand enough. Is it not a mercy then? Is it not an act of grace when those lesser hopes and dreams are shattered? This is an excerpt from a liturgy for the death of a dream. So let this disappointment do its work. My truest hopes have never failed. They have merely been buried beneath the shoveled muck of disillusion, or encased in a carapace of self-serving desire. It is only false hopes that are brittle, shattering like shells of thin glass to reveal the diamond hardness of the unshakable eternal hopes within. So shake and shatter all that would hinder my growth, O God. Unmask all false hopes, that my one true hope might shine out, unclouded and undimmed. So let me be tutored by this new disappointment. Let me listen to its holy whisper, that I might release at last these lesser dreams, that I might embrace the better dreams you dream for me and for your people and for your kingdom and for your creation. Let me join myself to these, investing all hope in the one hope that will never come undone or betray those who place their trust in it. Teach me to hope, O Lord, always and only in you. Part 2, what the Merlot says, or the true hope. In the 21st chapter of Revelation, we're invited to imagine a future in which there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. In John's apocalyptic vision, we find a hope capable of sustaining the full weight of our souls, our setbacks, and our suffering. The sweep of Scripture paints a picture so brilliantly and achingly and beautifully hopeful, in fact, that we half fear to believe it. This glorious vision of what we and all creation will one day be, restored, redeemed, recreated. It is the coming untrue of all sad things. It is this vision of where history is heading, capturing our imaginations, that forms and fuels our hope and has power to shape our lives and choices now. Because that kingdom will be fully established, and it has already broken in the incarnation of God himself taking on human flesh. It has broken into us, and now we might even begin to spread redemptively in our world this kingdom through our relationships and our vocations. My Anglican pastor told me that for him, consecrating the elements for communion was a huge step the first time it was his responsibility. The act of consecration is a conscious drawing forth, a lifting up, a marking out, a recognition of these particular things as holy, not because this bread and this wine are any more holy than all other bread and all other wine, but because by this conscious act, by this liturgy, we are reminding ourselves of the truth that everything in the world will one day be this. All parts of creation will one day be seen for what they truly are, viewed again through the knowledge of their consecration. And so this bread and this cup of wine, so consecrated, are like a first fruits, a reminder, a means of refocusing our vision with a greater clarity that sees all things, even if only for this flickering moment, as they more truly and eternally are, imbued with a holy light. This is the work of the imagination, expanding our hope, aligning it with things eternal, rescuing our understanding, restoring our vision, refocusing our hope, reclaiming the main narrative of a king and a kingdom and a redemption that is already active in our lives and world and that will one day be complete. Paleontologist Kurt Wise said, "We are not a product of our past. We are a product of our future. That is a Christian understanding of our lives." The eternal optimist Sonny Kapoor in the movie The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, upon learning that the parents of the girl he loves have pledged her to be married to another, blurts out to his weeping girlfriend, "Everything will be all right in the end, and if it is not all right, then it is not the end." Paul writes in Romans, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies, for in this hope we were saved. The prophet Isaiah says, on this mountain, he, God, will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. Brennan Manning recounts in his book, Lion and Lamb, several years ago, a priest visited a 16-year-old girl who lay dying in a Phoenix hospital. She looked into his worried and grief-stricken face, he recalls, and said to him, "Don't be afraid." This is the precise meaning of Christian hope. Don't be afraid. It is most profound when the dying can say to the living, "Do not be afraid." These diverse witnesses all attest to the size and scope of the hope we have been invited to imagine. It is nothing less than the eucatastrophe of death undone, the full blossoming of life and immortality, the realization of human flourishing, of unbroken communion with our Creator and all His people and all His creatures and all His creation. It is our vocation and calling restored to its rightful place. As Old Testament professor John Walton sums up, it is the call to be an angled mirror, reflecting God's wise order into the world and reflecting the praises of all creation back to the Creator. This vision describes a hope so huge that even those of us who are followers of Christ can easily miss it, because it is larger than our entire field of vision. It is a hope more brilliant, vivid, and real than the feeble machinery of our eyes and minds can process. And yet, how our souls do resonate with it. I'm going to read an excerpt from a liturgy for an inconsolable homesickness. The shape of that ache for another time and place is the imprint of eternity within our souls. So let those sorrows do their work in me, O God. Let them stir such eternal yearnings as would fix my journey forward toward that place for which I've always pined. O my soul, have there not always been signs? O my soul, were we not born with hearts on fire? Before we were old enough even to know why songs and waves and starlight so stirred us, had we not already tiptoed to the edge of that vast sadness, bright and good, and felt ourselves somehow stricken with a sickness unto life? Hardly had we ventured from our yards when we felt ourselves so strangely far from something and somewhere that we despaired of ever reaching, that we turned to hide the welling of our eyes. We knew it even then as the opening of a wound this world cannot repair, the first birthing of that weight every soul must wake up to alone, because it is the burden of that wild and lonely space that only God in His eternity can fill. And as we wait, this sacred homesick sorrow works in us to cultivate a faith that knows one day He will. That is the holy work of homesickness, to teach our hearts how lonely they have always been for God. So let these sighs and tears, Lord Christ, prepare me for that better gladness that will be mine. Let all your children learn to grieve well in this life, knowing we are not just being homesick. We are letting sorrow carve the spaces in our souls that joy will one day fill. Part 3 is what the Guinness says, or the present outworking of the eternal hope, and how, because of such a great hope, we can now labor hopefully with those ends in view. Without the cultivation of our imaginations to see, to believe where human history is going, to that king and kingdom of love and righteousness and wonder and glory and beauty. Without that guiding vision, we will burn out as idealists, or sell out as pragmatists, or lash out as moralists. It is precisely our capacity to imagine what is yet to come that gives us such hope as to undertake love's labors despite circumstances or seeming outcomes. In Colossians, Paul names this the faith and love that spring from the hope that is stored up for you in heaven. It is the hope of what is to come that gives us courage and vision to act and to labor now in this place we occupy between the lost garden and the eternal city. If our hopes are anchored in that eternal city, then we are freed to labor hopefully in the cities where we find ourselves now, LA included, to expend our sweat and compassion and creativity here in view of that approaching hope. Many of you are doubtless familiar with author and apologeticist Os Guinness. I'm going to tell you a rather remarkable story about his great-great-great-grandfather, Arthur Guinness, who founded the Guinness Brewery in the 18th century. My intention here is neither to endorse nor criticize the consumption of his product, as I believe such things to be subjects that clearly fall under what the Apostle Paul called disputable matters that are ultimately questions of individual conscience before God. The point is simply the real-world transformation a person can effect when their vision for vocation is about something larger than just making a profit. And I tell this story because it offers a sort of picture of what we, as followers of Christ, are to be about in the cities and towns where we find ourselves living today. It was in 1760 or so when Arthur Guinness opened a brewery in Dublin, and the city at the time was in a sorry state. The death rate in Dublin was the highest of any city in Europe. Disease was rampant. There was constant and often violent tension between Protestants and the Catholic minority. People were crammed several families to a dwelling. As basic a necessity as water was unsafe to drink. Gin, however, was plentiful and alcoholism was epidemic. It's estimated, in fact, that every fourth or fifth house in Dublin was a gin joint selling a cheap home brew. Poverty and squalor were everywhere. The prophet Isaiah, speaking into the hard conditions of his own day, foresaw a hopeful future where men would not be focused on their own survival or selfish gain, but would care for one another. Each man, Isaiah wrote, will be like a shelter from the wind and a refuge from the storm, like streams of water in the desert and the shadow of a great rock in a thirsty land. Arthur Guinness seems to have been a man who resonated with such a vision. He could have founded his enterprise elsewhere and arguably had it be more initially profitable. But seized by a better vision, he chose to found his brewery in the midst of that desperate city that he loved. And so he signed a lease on 4 acres that housed an old idle brewery, and he began his work. Dubliners considered his product to be tasty. It was well crafted and much, much safer than the local water. And even more importantly, it provided a low alcohol alternative to the highly intoxicating gin that was so widely consumed, which was part of Arthur's intent. His facility provided stable employment, allowing men who otherwise would have had to abandon their families for months at a time to leave town and find work, to remain in Dublin, so families stayed intact that wouldn't have. He employed 2 doctors full-time so that all Guinness employees and their families would have free and regular medical care. He paid for annual holiday outings for his employees and their families. He paid higher wages than were typical for the day. Arthur commissioned a survey of the horrid housing conditions in the area and subsequently built new and better housing for his workers, houses that are still in good enough condition to be considered hip and trendy addresses today, more than 250 years later. He provided ongoing educational opportunities free of charge for all employees and their spouses, classes in music, art, cooking, first aid, financial management, infant care, and more, because he was so concerned about the flourishing of these families. He staged public concerts, and he built an athletic field for his employees and their families. Perhaps most scandalous for that day, Arthur, a Protestant, hired Catholics as well and treated all of his employees with respect, even advocating for the rights of the Catholic minority in his community, even at the risk of losing business for doing so. Intentionally planted in the midst of degradation and squalor, the Guinness Company became an epicenter of restoration in Dublin, dramatically increasing the flourishing of individuals and families and of the town for generations. Some Dubliners still get misty-eyed when speaking of the impact of Arthur Guinness on their town. And when you look at the legacy of the generations of Arthur's heirs, who tended to go down the paths of serving via either medicine or the ministry, right down to Os Guinness himself, you see the passion for a Christ-centered culture care that was passed down. But really, I give you all that backstory in order to tell you what might be the most striking and wonderful fact about the Guinness story. In December of 1759, Arthur Guinness signed a lease on those 4 acres in the middle of Dublin's misery and squalor for the sum of £100 down and £45 a year, both of which were reasonable sums for the time. But here's the crazy thing. Arthur Guinness negotiated that lease for a term of 9,000 years. 9,000 years. Is it possible that this suggests a man whose imagination was shaped by an eternal hope? As if an eternal city was on its way, and Arthur was trying to make a good down payment. He wanted to build a thing that would do good service to the people of his city, alleviating suffering, encouraging wholeness, while hoping that what he would build might continue such service for untold generations, perhaps even until that more eternal city was at last revealed. He seems to have been a man who had the audacity to imagine such a hope and the faith to labor mightily unto that end. And when Arthur Guinness signed that 9,000-year lease and began to serve his employees and his town so well, I would like to think that he knew exactly what he was doing. I would like to think that he was intentionally rehearsing the new creation. I'll close with an excerpt from a liturgy for those who work in wood and stone and metal and clay. I wrote this for friends who do specifically work in these elements, but in a broader sense, I was writing it for all of us as a call to labor in our vocations today, whatever they might be, but to labor in light of our eternal hopes. Bless, O Lord, this work of creation, that by my labors I might craft a thing that sings with the very substance of my hope. I am here to rehearse the new creation in the making of this thing. Breathe, O God, into my lifeless works that they might somehow hold in their feeble forms such angles and fragments and rumors of the fire of the glory that is already made ready and waiting to burst forth from the seams of creation's old garment, when you but speak the word, and all things sin-soaked and subject to futility will be suddenly unsodden and revealed in their truer forms, in a new turning of the light, now resurrected, now shed, the great groan of the world, now displaying in full measure the glory they were intended to hold at their first crafting. I am here to rehearse the new creation in the making of this thing. Listen, all who labor, and my own hands and heart also, hear heaven's tidings now told as hammer rings, saw strums, and chisel strikes. The hours and years you spend in this toil of mastering your imperfect crafts, for joy in the nature and the working of these good elements, for joy in the beauty of the things created, for knowledge of God's good pleasure at the evidence of his image reflected in us and our images reflected in what we make, for expression of love in this slow and obedient fashioning of pleasing and durable items to do good service to generations, and for the offering of arts and eloquent objects which whisper to the souls of their beholders stirrings of eternal things that words cannot convey. To all who traffic in the crafting of such elements, hear these tidings. Those hours and labors are not lost. What you have worked is more than it now seems. The economy of creation is backloaded and sits on springs. What you have made will one day be unveiled, unleashed, take wing or glow with glory coursing from that cracked chrysalis you had fashioned in defiance of the deep shadows of this age. And in that turning of the page, we will raise our voices in chorus and say, in defiance of the curse, we had been rehearsing all along the new creation in the making of these things. Amen.
Wow, I feel like everybody's just simmering in that very rich and deep presentation. Doug, I'm reminded of a conversation we had recently as I was reflecting on your background as a creative. I thought I'd kind of kick off this Q&A with a little conversation we had that you responded to, which I found really fascinating and helpful. I was thinking about, I mean, LA is full of creatives, but not just creatives, but people that are struggling and in transition and trying to find their way with all the changes and dynamics, and thinking about calling and how does that even intersect with needs to pay the bills and have sometimes cases temporary work or multiple kind of opportunities going on in parallel, and to live in that and to do that and still attending to the call of God. And you told a little bit about your story, kind of thinking that through of call yourself. I thought that'd be great if you'd share a little bit about that.
Sure. At least as much as I can remember of what I might have previously said. I think it was an important thing for me at a certain point to realize that if I have a call, I can't be too invested in the outcome of my efforts in relation to that call. I mean, our tendency is to want to judge whether we're pursuing the right thing or doing the right thing, or whether this is really my calling, based on, the immediate results, how it's received by our peers, or is it economically successful? And I think it doesn't take much of a survey of some of the most beloved and cherished painters and novelists and other creators across the last few hundred years to realize that there are a lot of them who, who their poems never saw publication during their lifetime, or they sold one or two paintings during their lifetime and were dismissed and ridiculed. And it was only with the context of time that people, that really, I guess, the rest of the world caught up to the beauty and the brilliance of what they might have been doing. And if we look at the Old Testament prophets, I mean, they certainly had specific, distinct calling, but not many of them were much appreciated or celebrated during their lives. And so I think we have to step back a little bit and be willing to let go of the metrics of our current culture, this time and place in history of how success is defined, and recognize that it's quite possible that I have a calling, and that might be running in parallel to the work I'm doing to pay the bills, which certainly, even in that context, there are the general callings that we have as a believer to be salt and light, to represent Jesus wherever we are. So it's not that there's no calling and no eternal meaning and context for those vocations, but if there's a specific calling in terms of occupying this specific place, creating these things, or serving this particular group of people, it's not necessarily going to be visibly tied to how I pay my electric bill this month. It is such a blessing when that is the case. And in my own history of, I've been pretty much self-employed since I was in my early 20s. And there have been, in those 3 decades or so, there have been times when what I was passionate about doing and really sensed, had some understanding that I think this is what I'm supposed to be doing. This is my calling. There were those rare times where that was paying the bills. But there were a lot more years when I was having to hustle just to, cover the mortgage and the electric bill. And sometimes that meant working temp jobs, driving for Uber or whatever it might be. But not abandoning the pursuit of those things that I feel like if there is a vocational aspect to the reasons why I exist and how God has uniquely created me, then these are the things I don't want to come to the end of my life without having pursued and invested in, regardless of those visible outcomes.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's so helpful. There's some good questions rolling in here. Let me read you the top one. In your daily life, how do you effectively cultivate this hope and fan into flame your imagination of the new creation? It's a great question.
I would probably have answered that from very different perspectives at various points in my life. With the work that I'm doing now, which is mostly liturgy writing, and in fact, what I've been working on for at least the last 1.25 years. Hope it hasn't been 1.5 years yet, because it doesn't seem like it should have taken that long, but it's just been a wrestling match from start to finish. But I'm writing a book of liturgies that center on the topics of seasons of dying and of grieving the loss of someone. And pretty much on a daily basis, as I come to the task of sitting down to try to write, I am there's no illusion that I am equipped or capable to do this. So in this season of life, the answer to that question would be that it's actually the distance between what I believe my calling is right now and my ability to actually fulfill that calling. It's the recognition of that vast gulf. It's like standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon. And it's like, really? I'm supposed to jump across here? That ultimately drives me to a place of hope, because it drives me daily back to a recognition of my utter dependence and the understanding that this is not, I mean, yes, it's been given to me, it's been set in front of me as a task to steward. But I know that apart from this being something that God is calling me to, and something that He will equip me for, and that He will meet me in, that I'm not going to be able to accomplish it. So my hope is actually a result of my recognition of my own weakness and inability to do the thing to which I'm called, because there's a freedom in that, right? There's a freedom in recognizing I can't accomplish this. So actually, once I reach that point, some of the stress is lifted off my shoulders, because then I'm free to sit down and say, okay, God, here I am, I'm ready, I'm going to start working. Will you somehow, by the mysteries of your providence and grace, meet me in this and make of it something more than what I can bring to it, because I know that what I can bring is not enough. It's very much I think I probably don't go more than 2 days without really thinking about the story of the loaves and the fishes, and just recognizing myself as that little boy who, okay, he has a basket of, a few loaves and small fish. And his only hope for that to be sustaining, to the people is to offer it, to give it to God, who alone can bless it and break it and then give it back to His people to redistribute. And I think that's what all of us as followers of Jesus are to be doing in our vocations. That's the picture of what we're about. That's the posture. And it's humbling in a way, but until it's humbling, it's stressful if you feel like somehow you have to feed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish.
Exactly. No, that's great. That's very helpful. Here's a good question. How balance the view of what will happen in the future versus why we should even bother to do anything today, whatever we're supposed to do today, question mark. It's like they're trying to figure out the tension of balancing the future or future hope with bothering with action today.
Well, if I'm understanding the question, I think that that it is the degree to which we apprehend, buy into the vision of that future hope that enables us to labor hopefully today. And it goes back to that thing of not being invested in the outcome. I mean, we are free to seek to be obedient in our labors today, regardless of what we see as the results, because, and this is part of what I was trying to get at in that liturgy for those who work in wood and stone and metal and clay, in that idea that the economy of creation is backloaded and sits on springs, that the result of our labors, once we've offered them to God and are seeking to pursue doing His work and being His witnesses within the context of the places He's placed us in our families and communities and vocations, is that we can take it as a matter of faith that there are that what is being eternally built that there is something greater that will be revealed. And it's an easy way to consider it when we think of someone, making, working in clay. Like my friend Eddie does pottery, and he gave me this communion chalice that he made, which is beautiful. But you can imagine that the idea that Eddie's labors, lovingly crafted, the time spent learning this craft and working with the elements God made, and creating things that are beautiful and useful for people, that in the new creation, when God's glory is unveiled, that the works we've created, that, is it possible that even physical works like this are going to be seen in a different light, charged with more glory and grandeur, than what we can see now? And by the same token, even things that aren't physical objects, but the things that we do, in obedience, in the ways that we serve people, even thankless tasks, even serving someone whose response is irritation or grumpiness, because of just what they're struggling with in their own life and where they are. And we could look at that and say, well, that was a failure. I tried to show God's love to this person and they responded in this way. But we don't see the whole story, and we don't see the whole picture. But if Scripture is true, then what we're doing now is not separate from what will be. That it's like the things we are doing now, maybe a good analogy is, these are seeds that are going to bloom into something eternal. And to the degree that we can apprehend that kind of vision, it frees us from caring so much, or letting ourselves be frustrated or stymied by the responses that we get.
Yeah, it makes me think of Tolkien's short story Leaf by Niggle. It's a beautiful illustration. I encourage people to read that. It gives a good picture of finding ultimate value that goes unseen in all of what we experience in this life. Yeah, it was kind of interesting reflection on Tolkien's own struggle with that, trying to, as he was writing. Yeah, we're going to squeeze in one last question at the risk of running over a minute or two. I love this question. It says, how to distinguish between crafting something with care for God versus crafting an idol? Like weighing, what's the direction I'm giving this, and ultimately, where do I know where that line needs to be drawn?
Yeah, and that's, I don't know that one person can answer that for another, because that really is about the orientation of the heart toward God and in relation to the thing that you're making. Certainly, any of us who actually vocationally craft creative works, that is an easy tendency at some point or another to fall into, to assign too much value to the work, and to lose the context of why we're creating. I think for me, it's probably been more important in addressing that issue, rather than to address it by considering that issue, but to actually come from the standpoint of when I'm writing, I'm trying to remember that the reason that I do this is because there's a community of people I'm trying to serve by what I'm doing. And that the context for art making is community. It is to serve community. That's it. And I think part of the problem for us is that we're in a culture where art and artists have been divorced from any such context and have been elevated to this thing of, oh, well, you can't question that, that's art. You know? And if you're operating, you know, within that kind of skewed paradigm, then you're already starting at a place where art is on a pedestal and kind of deified. And you know, but I have a friend, Sam Smith, SD Smith, who writes fantasy novels for kids and families, and he has really given me a lot to think about, because he speaks in terms of hospitality. That he sees writing a book as an exercise of hospitality, that you are creating this space to welcome people into, and that, you know, that dictates some of the choices, a lot of the choices that you would make of what kind of content to place in the work, where it's not just like, you know, oh, an artist can, you know, do whatever they want, and, you know, their job is to shock and to challenge people and make them re-question their assumptions and make them uncomfortable. I mean, yeah, sometimes art does make us uncomfortable, in the same way that, you know, the prophet Nathan's storytelling made David uncomfortable when he needed to be made uncomfortable. But there was a specific reason for that. It was for the conviction of real sin. But just to shock for the sake of shocking, you know, that's not hospitable. You wouldn't invite someone over for dinner and then do something absolutely shocking just to shock them and make them, you know, that's not hospitality. And so this view that art is a way of practicing hospitality, and that art has its only valid context in the context of community and serving community, then you no longer have this paradigm of artists up here and other people down here. It really is this posture of the artist, the creator, as servant. How do I serve these people? And to serve them, I have to know them. I have to recognize their needs. And it's not about my own, ego being expressed, right? And, you know, I think we always have to be checking in and letting our hearts be, bringing them into the presence of God, and listening, letting other people who know and love us speak into our lives to curb any of those tendencies to kind of just shoot off on a tangent or a trajectory of, you know, being very indulgent in a way that would not serve community and would not be hospitable. So
that's great. I so appreciate the thoughtful answers. And I have my apologies to those questions lingering. There's a lot of good questions out there. That makes it both a difficult and a good place to end, because people are very keenly interested in interacting with you. And we so appreciate your joining us today, Doug. So
yeah, well, I'm delighted to have been able to. So thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Let me just give everyone a quick reminder here before we wrap up that we have still open application season for our Framework Fellows program. Encourage you to check out faithandworkinla.com for that, as well as our upcoming webinar in 2 weeks. We have a really thoughtful presentation on a gospel response to COVID-19 work disruption. Missy Wallace is a national leader at a global faith and work initiative, and Chris Neal will be joining us from Azusa Pacific University and Made to Flourish, and we're just really looking forward. I've heard this presentation before, and it is very, very helpful, so I encourage you to check that out. So thank you for joining us. As a brief survey when we end the meeting. We really appreciate you filling out for us. It's so helpful to us, and encourage you and appreciate your hanging in there a couple extra minutes. It was a great time with Doug. So God bless. We'll look forward to being with you again soon. Bye-bye.